Okay, well, let's briefly just talk a little bit about the spinal cord. There's just a few points that I want you to take away from this discussion of the spinal cord. One is that there's a longitudinal organization to the spinal cord, which is to say there are segments of the spinal cord that can be recognized by the attachment of 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So in the cervical region of the spinal cord, we have 8 pairs of nerves that attach. In the thoracic region of the spinal cord, we have 12 pairs of nerves that attach, one on either side, of course. And then both in the lumbar region and in the sacral region of the cord, we have 5 nerves that attach, 5 lumbar and 5 sacral. And then finally, there's a single coccygeal nerve that attaches at the very bottom of the spinal cord. So when you add all those numbers up together, we get the number 31. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Now, that's one way of characterizing the long axis of the spinal cord. Another way is to note that there are 2 regions where the diameter of the spinal cord is enlarged. One in the cervical region and another in the lumbosacral region. Now, you can probably imagine what's going on here. There's an expansion of the numbers of neurons and the circuitry of the spinal cord that's related to these important locations along the vertebral axis of the body. Namely, this is where our arms are attaching to the body axis and the legs. And in these 2 regions of the spinal cord, these regions are where we find the nerves that are providing motor output to the extremities as well as providing sensory input. So there are enlargements or an increase in the diameter of the spinal cord there in the sacral region, in the cervical region, as well as in the lumbosacral region. And this thickening then allows for an increase in the circuitry that is required to govern the activities of the arms and the legs. One other point to make before we leave this view of the spinal cord, I want you to notice where we find the location of the inferior end of the spinal cord. We find it not at the bottom of the vertebral column, but we actually find it at about the level of L1 or L2, that is vertebral body levels L1 or L2. Well, of course, it didn't begin that way. As the spinal cord was first developing, it was approximately the same length as the bones of the vertebral column. So the spinal cord filled up that space within the vertebral column. But as we grow, and especially in early life, the non-neural structures grow at a faster rate, so we end up with a longer vertebral column than spinal cord. And as a result, the spinal nerves end up continuing to exit through the canals where they first developed, but now there is a long length of nerve root that develops as the vertebral column grows at a faster rate than the spinal cord. And what we end up with as a result of all of this is a beautiful structure called the horse's tail, or the cauda equina. And so in the lumbosacral regions of the spinal cord, what we see are these long nerve roots that extend like a horse's tail from the lumbosacral enlargement out through the canals between the vertebrae, space called the intervertebral foramina, that allow for the passage of these spinal nerve roots. So I say all that to emphasize that I don't want you to be confused about the nomenclature that we use to describe level within the spinal cord. If we're talking about, for example, the L2 level, you need to understand, are we talking about the spinal nerve? Are we talking about the vertebra or the vertebrae itself? Or are we referring to the segment of the spinal cord? And I'll always try to be clear about that as we're talking about these anatomical issues. So for example, the second vertebral body is found right at this level here. And that's where we find the emergence of the second lumbar nerve. However, that nerve attaches to the spinal cord at some significantly higher level. So when it comes to understanding the relationship of lesions within the spinal cord to dermatomal levels of paresthesia or anesthesia, it will be important to know these relationships between spinal cord segment, nerve, and vertebrae. So I'd just like to make a few points as we look a little bit more closely here at the vertebral column. What I want you to notice is that the dorsal or the posterior aspect of the vertebrae is off to the right, sort of coming at you, and the ventral or the anterior aspect is to the left, with the dorsal ventral axis running something like this through this illustration. Okay? So then it makes sense to recognize a ventral root that's coming out of the ventral horn of the spinal cord. This ventral root is going to send signals out to striated muscle, and these are motor signals leading to the contraction of those muscle fibers. Now, that spinal nerve is also going to contain sensory axons that may be derived from special receptors in skin or some other kind of structure. And the course of these axons will run right through that same spinal nerve. So we call that a mixed spinal nerve. And then there's a cell body that sits in a ganglion right here. And the central process of that axon will enter the spinal cord. So when we're talking about the spinal nerve itself, I want you to understand that it is mixed with both motor and sensory components. But once we get down to the roots, then we have a ventral motor root and a dorsal sensory root. All right? Now we also have something called the sympathetic chain, which is a chain of ganglia that runs in the long axis, or the superior to inferior axis of the spinal cord on either side. And we'll talk about this when we get into a discussion of the autonomic nervous system. But within these sympathetic chain ganglia are the neurons that innervate viscera, innervate vascular arterioles, basically wherever there is sympathetic innervation of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. But that's where we find those kinds of motor neurons, in the sympathetic chain. And notice that the sympathetic chain is connected by a series of small connecting rootlets that go back and forth between the spinal nerve and the sympathetic chain as that nerve emerges out of the canal formed between the vertebrae of the vertebral column. All right, well, that's really all that I wanted to tell you today about cranial nerves and spinal nerves before having a chance to focus in on the brainstem and show you the cranial nerves in the lab. So if you'll bear with me, we'll make a transition. And when you see me next, I'll be in the neuroanatomy lab with the brain in my hands. So I'll see you there.